Hello, welcome. I'm Pauline from Pauline's Quilters World, and I'm delighted you can join me because I want to introduce you to our Lulu quilt pack. Now I'm going to explain a little bit about this step by step. It's going to be a whole program where we will talk you through all the really important tips and techniques that we think you need to know to be able to achieve this gorgeous quilt. But to start with, let me tell you, it is a Quilt As You Go quilt that will teach you lots about how you can put any of your quilts together quilt as you go. So this will show you the basics, and we'll show you other things throughout the filming so you'd be able to advance on. But let's take a look at the quilt. We've got one version here on the table. It's in the bright colours, and it is a quilt that you can make in any colours you want, and we'll explain that as we go through. The one up here on the wall is just beautiful. We've done a bit wider sashing on this one compared to the one on the table, so it's going to give you options of what you can do. But the quilt's named after my granddaughter. Her name is Lana, and her daddy, my son, calls her his little Lulu. And she happened to be with us when we were making these quilts. So she said, "Is that going to be my quilt, Mama?" And I said, "Yes, of course, we'll name it after you." So let me introduce you to Lulu. But let's go through the pack and let's show you what you get in here. We give you everything except the fabric and the batting. We give you all the things that you need to be able to achieve this quilt. So we'll open the pack, and inside we have the complete pattern. There's over 20 pages of instructions in here. It's like its own little booklet. So we take you through, we give you very great coloured photos, and you'll see a photo of my granddaughter here and my grandson, so you get a bit of an understanding of what it's all about. We talk about the grain of the fabric. We give you each block so you can see exactly where you'd use your particular colours, how many to cut of each one, and how it's constructed together. So we go through and show you all of those patterns. There's quite a few of them in there. Then we get to all the appliques, because there's lots of appliques, so it's like a little sampler quilt. It'll get you started. We talk about, show you photos of joining it together, which we're going to show you in the videos too, so it'll make it very easy for you. So we go right through and show you everything right up to putting the binding on. But also in the pattern, we give you all the applique templates. So we give you a little diagram of what the template is going to make up, and if the camera can come down onto this block here, this is the template to make this block. So the outside edge is the outside shape. The cutout in here is where you get this shape from, and then there is the circle. So we come over to the next applique design, which is this one. Here we have the outline shape. We get this little shape here from this section. We get this shape here from this section. So all the little bits, the circles, you get all your circles out of this one. So you're just basically going to trace around this and cut your fabric up. So you don't have to have a paper pattern and trace it onto something else. So you do get all of the applique shapes. This is the design for the centre. You have the layout sheet so you know exactly how it's going to be positioned, and there's all your shapes. So we do give you all of these. Every one of those is packed separately. So that in itself is a great help. Then for all of our piece blocks, all of the blocks where you're going to cut them pieces out and join it together on your sewing machine, like we have with all of these blocks, we actually give you all the templates for these. So we're going to explain those and how to use them step by step, so you have a whole pack of all the templates. And these make up 9-inch blocks, so you would be able to use these forever to make any 9-inch block that you want to make that contains all of these different shapes. So that is a great pack for you. Also, we want to teach you about balancing your colours, and that can be a real challenge for a lot of people, is what colours go with what? What is the right fabric to use? Because in a lot of patchwork we talk about lights, mediums and darks. So we have put in your colour balance tool in here, so we'll be able to teach you how to use this to put over the top of your fabric so you can identify what will be your light, your medium and your dark, because in some of your patterns you will see that it works best if you have contrast fabrics. We've used solid colours here to indicate, you know, where you would be using your fabric. So the little colour template will be able to help you immensely. We've got the heart in it, so you'll be able to see the real fabric, and then when you look through here, you'll be able to see what shade you're going to be working with. So that's all included in the pack. There is a list on here of all the different tools that we recommend you use to be able to get accurate piecing, accurate cutting, and joining everything together really smiffy to get it really looking beautiful. We tell you what amount of fabrics you need to use and to purchase to get started. So I'm just going to explain some of the different things to you so that you can get an understanding, and as you make your quilt, just keep watching this video. It will help you be able to meet any challenges that you may have as you work through that, because I respect and understand that everyone that will watch this and want to make a quilt like this are at a different level. So hopefully we can start you off right from a beginner, but if you've been doing quilts for quite some time, I'm really sure we can teach you some new hints and tips. So stick with us and watch all the different videos. Now let's talk about the fabric. We made the quilts, these two quilts, we made them out of a layer cake. Now if you don't know about these, all the fabric companies do these now, and you can get such a beautiful collection. And you know what? It saves you going out trying to choose all the individual colours, because when they pack these together, it's a range. It all works together. So they're usually 10.5-inch squares, and a variety of colours, as you can see. They're just beautiful. This one is called, that we used, it's a layer cake by Moda, and it's called Canning Day. So it's really lovely. It has all the code numbers down here, so if you need to buy more, you've got a code number to reference to. They're in order. But you get a lovely selection of lights, mediums and darks in this collection, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But there's lots of different beautiful ones out there. You might like to use really bright colours. You might like to get fabrics that are more masculine. It is purely up to you what colours you decide to make your quilt out of. But we'd love to see photos as you work through, and it'll just make it all exciting for everybody to see what we're all doing. And we'll share those photos out if it's all right with everybody. But now, in doing that, you're going to need a background fabric. Now, because we've used brights on this quilt, and then we've used the more pretty fabrics in this quilt, a white background work really well. But if you're going to use more muted colours, more dirty colours or more masculine colours, you might like to go with a darker background fabric. You might like to use a muddy background. You might like to use a pure plain white. This one that we've used has got gorgeous little butterflies on it. So we just love working with different textures in fabric. So the choice is yours of what you use as the background. But always remember, it's probably best to buy your layer cake pack first and then look around the store to find a really nice backing that will blend with it. But when we talk about all the different fabrics and how we're going to balance the light, mediums and darks, here we have the leftovers. This is what we've got left out of a layer cake from making the quilt behind me. So you've still got lots of fabrics left. If you wish to make the quilt bigger, that is perfectly fine. You would just make more of the same blocks, or you would create some new blocks, but just keep them all the same size basically. But you've got plenty of fabric to go further with this. There's some fabrics in the collection that we didn't think was going to suit with what we were doing, like we definitely didn't want to use the grey stripe, but that's really great because we'll use that in another project. We did use like this dark brown, and we can instantly see that that is darker than this fabric. You can, naturally your eye can pick that up. But let's say we were going to be working with these two fabrics. Now that can be hard to identify. You know, a lot of people will realise that's light and that's more of a medium colour. But let's just go down in the pile And if we started working with these two, you could probably identify them as being a little bit different in shadings. But let's just put the colour template over it. Now we just need to see, and it might be best if I hold this up. Now I don't know if you can see in there, can you see that one would be more darker than the other? So this is where this little tool really comes in handy, because most of us would think of those two as the same value. But they're really not. And you've got that little heart there, so you can hold it and look through it too, so your eye can see the difference in the fabric. Now if I bring this one back up here, as I said before, we can naturally see that that's dark, but the colour connector can show you that naturally that is darker than this one. But it's just a nice way of working out to get a balance of colour. So use this tool, it's in the kit for that very purpose. And I think if you have this in your sewing studio, every time you make a quilt, this is a great tool to use. Because a lot of fabrics, when we buy them, you might notice that they've got little dots along the selvage. That is a very handy tool too when you're at a shop and you're trying to choose your different fabrics. You can pick out your main fabric, look at all the little dots that are on the selvage, take that piece of fabric around the store with you and choose the shades from those little dots, and you know that they will all work together then in a quilt that you're going to produce. So that's just to introduce you to this template, and hopefully you'll get to use that and you'll be able to see a really nice balance as you start to work through your blocks. Now let's talk about your batting and your backing. So a lot of us call our padding that we put in between our 3 layers, some people call it wadding, some people call it batting. But in this I'm going to call it batting because that's what I'm used to calling it. If we're going to do our quilts Quilt As You Go, as Lulu's quilt is, think about what you want to put on the back. Now if you want to disguise the quilt so it doesn't look like a Quilt As You Go quilt, I would suggest purchasing a busy fabric. Now when I say a busy fabric, like it could be like this one, it's just in the grey and white, but the pattern's very busy. You might like to get, like we've got on this quilt here, we've used a floral, but we didn't have enough when we were making this quilt up, so we've used a plain fabric on for the backing. The other thing you can do is you could put all different fabrics on the back of each block so the quilt looks totally reversible on the back, and that can look really fantastic. If you wanted to, if you've got lots of plain fabrics laying around like we have on this quilt here, I'll just show you the front of the quilt just so you get to see what it's like. You know, we've used a plain cream on the front and we had lots left over. So on the back of each block we put a cream, which is really lovely because the quilting stands out beautifully, and you could use that quilt completely upside down. So just think about what you want to put on the back. We've put the grey on the back of this quilt here on the back wall. We've used this beautiful fabric, and I just want to show you the back so you get a visual of what it looks like. So using a busy print, when we join it together you don't really see from the back that it's a Quilt As You Go quilt. So just think seriously about what you want to put on the back. And I always say please get a good quality fabric to put on the back of your quilt, because if you use something cheap and nasty on the back, it's not going to last like the front of the quilt will. And you know, and you're going to put a lot of work into this. It's going to be, you'll be very, very proud of it when you finish. So do invest in good quality fabric for the back of your quilt. Or as I said before, if you've got lots sitting there in your stash, put a different fabric on the back of each block. You could put different fabrics on the back of each border, because remember every piece is quilted before you join it together, and that's the nice thing about a Quilt As You Go quilt. And I've designed these sort of quilts up because I know there's so many people out there that are challenged to put a very big quilt through the little space on their little domestic machine and try and do nice quilting. Doing your quilts Quilt As You Go, which we'll go into as we advance on with this lesson, you're only going to quilt one block at a time. Now, to put a block that size underneath the needle of your spool machine makes it so easy for anybody to be a very good quilter. The other thing is, when we join our quilts together, Quilt As You Go, and you can see better up on this one, we don't want any bulk here at the seams where we join the blocks together. You want to eliminate any bulk that can be created doing your quilts Quilt As You Go. After many years of researching all the different battings and waddings that are out there on the marketplace, I particularly strongly suggest you use this beautiful batting. This is Hobbs Heirloom double-sided fusible batting. Now, it has a very light fuse on it. If I was happening to put my iron on this, if it was fusible, you would expect that fuse to stick to my iron. It doesn't, which is really wonderful. So it never clogs up the back of your iron. It's 80% cotton, 20% polyester, very light fuse on both sides. It comes off the roll as 2.4 wide. But if you were to purchase this from us, and we do sell it and it's very hard to get, so we do have it on our website, so please look there because we always keep supply of it. But when we look at this here, we would think that's the thickness. It's not the thickness, because when you get this, you need to peel it apart, because this is rolled under heat to make it compact to ship around the world. Pull this apart and you feel like you're ripping it, but you're not. You're just pulling the adhesive apart from one layer to the next. So it's quite a thin batting, which is great when we're using it because it feeds through the machine beautifully. Once we finish the quilt and we wash the quilt the first time, the batting bulks up and it does show out your quilting beautifully. Whether you free motion quilt, whether you just do straight lines, that's purely up to you, and we'll discuss that further as we move through. But be assured that your quilting will show up beautifully on this batting. It never ever pills through. So a lot of battings, as they get washed and worn over the years, you'll start to get the bit of pilling coming through the fibres of the fabric. This one never ever does that. This Lulu's quilt, this was made some years ago, and probably I'd say it's been washed probably 30-40 times in the washing machine and put in the dryer. There is no batting at all pilling through here. So it's a great batting to use, and that's the one I strongly recommend. So when you start joining all of these blocks together, you don't have that thickness here. The other beautiful thing about this, if you were going to be quilting with your feed dogs up, like a lot of quilters need to because they can't free motion quilt, if you quilt with your feed dogs up with a normal batting, you have to pin the quilts. And you need to use a walking foot because you get movement of the batting starts to stretch away from the fabrics. Be assured with this one, because we're going to iron the 3 layers together and the fusible, the very light fusing, holds your fabric to both sides, you do not need a walking foot. And I'm going to show you how we can quilt with a normal sewing foot or an open toe foot, feed dogs up and do beautiful quilting. So we'll show you that as we work through this lesson. So that's a little bit about our batting and your backing. So choose wisely when you go out to choose those fabrics. About the tools that I use and the ones that I recommend, and there is a list in the back of your pattern of the tools that we recommend, and we do have all of these on our website, and have a look around, see what you need. You may have some of them, and I'll give you the reason why I use them, and as we go through and cut some blocks out and you learn how to do that, you'll see why I use the tools I use. So let's go through the list. We like really good scissors, and we use these great handle ones because you know our fatter fingers can fit through these, and as they get a bit aged they're really good to use. They're very, very sharp. Be careful, they will cut you. So they're great scissors. They're the jack scissors that we use. Now for accurate piecing, I love to use the fork pins, the double fork pins. Now we'll talk extensively about these as we get to piecing the blocks together, but this is a twin pin, 2 pins that are joined together, and this will sit either side of the seam so you will get perfect points. And this is what this lesson is going to teach you, is how to get those points perfect. The cutting mat I use is use one of these 3-in-1 workboards. This is my ironing surface. This is my cutting mat. And this is my layout mat. And when I do my appliques, I'm going to show you why I use the sandpaper. So you can get these in different sizes. This is the large one that we sell. And then we do have the smaller one. If you've got a smaller workspace, we do have the smaller one. Now, if you don't like the fabric that's on here, you can cover this. You can put another cover on it, because some people just are fussy about what they like to use. And I'm one of those people. This one here is getting quite dirty on the top, so very soon I will cover this with another piece of fabric, and I just glue it on. So we've got the smaller cutting board, the layout mat, and then we've got the sandpaper, and then we can open them out as an ironing mat, and they work fabulously right near your sewing machine, so you're not up and down all the time. So we use those. The other thing we use is a Hera marker, which is this tool here. I'm going to show you how to use this. This is what we mark our straight line quiltings with. It doesn't put a mark on your fabric, it puts a crease, so you don't have any marks to wash out. So when we do straight line quilting, I can't quilt straight for the life of me, so I have a line that I follow, and I mark with this one. Sew slip mat. This is probably one of my favourite tools. This always is on the bed of my machine. For those that don't know about it, it has this brown paper on the back. Take the paper off. Do keep this, so if you take it off your machine, you wrap it back in this, because this side that the paper's on is sticky. It's got a tacky surface. This sticks to the bed of the machine. The feed dogs work, and the needle work up and down through this hole. So you put it on your machine. As you move your fabric through, you now have a very slippery surface. So you're not pushing the fabric through. You have not got any pressure on your shoulders or your hands. Everything slides through. Now these do collect any fluff. So if you found one day you put this on your machine, it doesn't stick. If you don't have time to go and wash it and soak it in hot soapy water to get all the fluff off the back, just use some sticky tape and stick it on there till you've got time to wash it. We do give you good cleaning instructions with this. Patchwork rulers, I'm very passionate about getting you onto the right rulers. I find over the years, with all the teaching I've done all around the country and around the world, one of the most common problems I come across is the inaccuracy of the lines on the quilting rulers. A lot of rulers, when we look at them, the inch lines can be thicker than the 1/2 inch and the 1/4 inch lines. Now I find that causes us a great lot of problems, because if I'm going to cut out using this ruler today and I cut on this side of the line today, just going to use this pointer. If I cut on this side of the line today and then turn my ruler around and come back and cut on that side of the ruler tomorrow, I'm actually on the other side of that thick line, and I could be anywhere between 4 and 5 threads out in every cut I make. Now 4 or 5 threads out in every cut you make on a 12-inch block, you could lose a whole 1/4 inch seam. So your block will, instead of coming out 12 and a half, it'll come out 12 and a quarter. So be very sure that you've got accuracy for your rulers. Now the best way to test that is, I use Rasant thread for my piecing, or you might use Wonderful or some other threads. The lines on your rulers, and I don't know whether you're going to be able to see this, but if I put my thread on this line, my line should be not outside that thread, because that's what I'm going to seam with. And we have people talking about scant seams and all that sort of thing. That is, a scant seam is to accommodate to the thickness of this line. So if this line's 1 thread thickness, you will use a normal 1/4 inch foot and you will have a perfect seam. And then your blocks will come out the size that they should. I use a very short ruler. This is the ruler I use to cut out all of my fabrics. I'm going to show you why I use this and how I use this as we move through this video. The other ruler I use a lot is this little 2.5 by 8 inch ruler. I find it so handy to use. The other thing about these rulers is they're engraved. Can you hear that noise? With my fingernail running across there. They're engraved deeply into the ruler. They're not stamped. So when I put this on my fabric, and when I'm cutting out, one of the common things we have with rulers is they slip. And you've got to put a lot of pressure on it, or you've got to put sandpaper dots or something on the back of the ruler to stop it moving. With these being so deeply engraved into the ruler, I hardly have to put any pressure because I don't get any movement out of the ruler. It sucks down onto the fabric. So that's another great thing of why we recommend these rulers. Flower head pins, we use these a lot. We use a really good quality sharp pin, and I'll show you how I use these when I fold my fabric to cut to keep everything accurate. So we'll teach you all about those. 1/4 inch foot for your machine. There's lots of different ones out there, and it depends what style of machine you've got to what foot is best to use. I use a Bernina. I love my Bernina, but this is a regular 1/4 inch foot. So with my needle in the center position and to the edge of the foot, it measures exactly 1/4 inch. So I'll put it up here so you can see that. Hopefully you can see that. Now, the thing is that if I'm going to have my needle in the center position and I use the edge of the foot as my 1/4 inch, I need to know that that is exactly the same 1/4 inch as what my ruler is. Don't think your ruler measures the same 1/4 inch as your foot. You may have to move your needle over 1 or 2 positions, but on my machine I know they all line up to be exactly the same. The other 1/4 inch foot that's a really good idea is the 1/4 inch foot that has this little arm. I find some of the machines, the foot with the arm down here it moves too much, and it moves as you're stitching, and particularly as you go over seam, that can throw you out. This one for my Bernina is very solid and it doesn't move. So a lot of times I will use this when I'm piecing my blocks together. So I have 2 different 1/4 inch feet. We do use an open toe foot, as we explained before. When we quilt, you can use an open toe foot. This is a regular sewing foot that I use with my feed dogs up. If I'm going to draw a quilting pattern onto my quilts to quilt, and I've got my feed dogs up, I'm able to see the lines when I'm quilting because I can see there's nothing in the road there to challenge my vision. This is opened. When we put our sashings on, we either use the open toe foot or we'll use the stitch in the ditch foot or the edge stitching foot. This is a foot that has a little guide that comes down through the middle of the foot, and I know it's very hard to see, but it has this little guide that comes down through the middle of the foot. When I stitch my sashings on, I can move my needle position. This guide sits right on the outside edge of the sashing. My needles sit right on the inside edge of the sashing. As I sew, I watch this guide. I don't watch the needle. And then I can get a lovely straight row of stitching when I put my sashings in place. So that's a great foot to use, either that or the open toe foot. Now, and we'll talk about free motion feet as we get to the quilting stage. I use the bias Sasha ruler, this ruler here. This is what I use to cut out all my bias for the stems. And this is a great ruler for cutting out anything on the bias, and we'll talk about that more as we go into it. I basically use the monopoly thread in my bobbin for most of this quilt when I put it together. Now, if you've got a background, like on this one here, when we quilted it, we had this monopoly thread in the top of the machine and in the bobbin. When we quilted this quilt, we had a lovely white thread on the top that had a nice sheen to it, and we had this thread in the bobbin. Because when we do our quilts Quilt As You Go, we quilt the blocks first. Once we've quilted the blocks, we then do the applique over the top of the quilting, which makes it so easy. But if I was to stitch all of this on like we've done with a variegated thread on the top, and if I had a normal thread in my bobbin, I would see the applique stitch at the back. But if I put the monopoly thread in my bobbin, I'm not going to have a bother. You won't see that stitching on the back because it's totally clear. Now this thread comes with this little, I call it a gauze jacket. Let's put it over my black shirt so you can see it. It's like a gauze. That's in the packet when you buy this thread from us. When you undo the thread for the first time, put this gauze on there. Now that's going to stay on there permanently now. So when I fill my bobbin, the thread's just going to come out from underneath the gauze. When I sew, the thread will just come out from under the gauze. And the reason we need that is because this is such a fine thread. If I don't have that on there, the thread can come off the spool too fast and get caught under the spool holder. When I put this on the bobbin, I need to wind my bobbin at a slower speed, and I need to only half fill the bobbin. If I fill my bobbin up with this thread completely, it is too much thread for your machine to cope with. Always remember, a fine thread, you get twice as much on the bobbin as what you would with a normal thread, so only half fill the bobbin, and then your machine will love it beautifully. So we use that all the time. When I'm piecing the blocks together, like when I'm doing any of the piece blocks, I'll have the rasant thread in the top and the bobbin, but when I do the quilting, I'll always have this in the bobbin. Now, the other thing we use is the Roxanne glue baster. I use this to do all my appliques. Because we quilt first, I find if I put a fusible web underneath my appliques, and we all know what they are, and there's some fantastic ones of those on the market, but I just find it adds too much stiffness over the top of the quilting, no matter which one I use. So when we cut the applique shapes out, I put a little dot of glue underneath all the pieces, all the way around the outside edge. Then I press it with a hot iron to set the glue. If I got a little bit of glue on my iron, it doesn't stick to the iron. If I put something down and I wasn't happy with the colour, or I wasn't happening with the positioning, I could pull that piece off and reposition it. So it's a lovely glue to use. It does not clog up on the needle, and it washes out when you wash your quilt for the first time. We use it to put all of our sashings in place, because I find if I pin my sashings, everything moves as I start to sew. If I glue it and press it, I get no movement, so I don't get my sashings walking ahead of themselves. The other thing I do, I cut out all of my fabrics with the little mini rotary cutter, the 18mm cutter. I find that if I use a big blade to cut out my shapes, and you've probably noticed it yourself, when you've got your ruler down and you're cutting with a bigger blade, you probably see your fabric moving slightly ahead of the blade. I find the bigger the blade, the bigger the rotation, and the more distortion I get, the more stretching I get. If I use a little blade, because the blade's so small, when I cut with this I don't get any movement out of the fabric at all. So we're going to show you how to use these. I would use the bigger one when I'm cutting out my batting, or when I'm trimming my blocks off, but basically for cutting out all of my blocks I use the small cutter. The other thing we use is the sashing tools. Now we've got, I think we designed 20 different styles of sashes now, but this set here is the most popular 10 out of those 20s. So working through this quilt, you'll be using some of these sashes. And also I have my Quilt As You Go book. This quilt is joined together with my this quilt's joined together with the between the block technique. So in my book I cover the back-to-back technique. So from the book you can learn all the different ways to join your quilts together, Quilt As You Go. To avoid blunting my needles all the time, I use the titanium top stitch needles. I use the size 80-12. Now a top stitch needle has a bigger eye, so when I use my fine threads they don't shred, because they don't get the heat friction through the eye. And being titanium coated, they last a lot longer than a nickel plated needle. So instead of changing my needles every 8 to 10 hours of stitching, I probably get 80 plus hours of stitching out of one needle, so they save you a lot of money. So just leave them in for your piecing, your applique, your quilting, stitching your binding down. They work brilliantly well for that. Fabric marking pens. We talked about the Hera marker before, but my favourite pencil that I use, and what I'll use to cut out all the applique shapes, is the Bohin marker. This comes with a set of white and black leads, which means I can change any colour thread to mark any coloured fabric. But it's just like a normal lead, but it has no chemicals or nasties in it, so it will always wash out of your fabric. You can iron over it, won't become permanent. So you can just get a really nice fine line. You can go as hard as you want to get a really dark line, but I don't suggest going too dark because you want to get rid of that line eventually. If I iron over it, it will not heat set. I know it will always wash out. The marks will erase off with its own eraser. When it's a darker line, you've got to rub a bit harder, but the line will come off. If I want to change to another coloured lead, I've got a black and a white lead in here together. I'm going to click down the top and hold the top down. I'm going to pull this black lead out and I'll click down the white lead. Then I'm able to mark any coloured fabric. When I want to mark on the dark fabric, I've got the white lead to do that. I'm going to put this lead straight back in. So it's very easy to change your lead colours. Don't have your lead out too far. If it comes out too far, it's going to break. So put your thumb on the top and push the lead back up inside. Now your lead will last you for such a long time. So that's my favourite marking pencil. And then, you know, you can use, when we've done the applique, you can use the beautiful variegated threads. I know Wonderful do beautiful threads, Superior do nice beautiful threads. So just make your choice. You could use the monopoly if you want on the top if you don't want to see your stitching. Or use a decorative thread. So that's just a little bit about the tools. The other great thing that I use all the time is the mini iron. So with my workboard here, I can be sitting at my machine, I can have my workboard set up against the side of the machine, I can have my iron sitting there, and I do love a mini iron. It just presses so neatly, and I'll show you as we start to piece the blocks together as we go further into this video why I use a mini iron. But if you have a mini iron, always lay it on a trivet. And we sell these trivets because I feel a mini iron is a little bit dangerous standing up, and I find because they're drawing minimal power compared to a big iron, if I leave it standing they don't retain the heat like they should. If I lay it on there, I can leave it laying there all day and the heat doesn't go through to the table. So that's just a little bit about our tools. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope you learn how to use them as we go through. Now let's talk about cutting out your background fabric, because a lot of people can be challenged getting things all straight and dealing with a big length of fabric, because we're going to work with about 2 meters or 2 and a bit yards of fabric for the background, example where all the white is. So I just want to go through how I prepare my fabric and how I cut it to make it very easy for myself. The first thing I'm going to do is, I don't trust this centre fold that's in our fabric when we buy it off the bolt, because a lot of times it's rolled onto the bolt by machine and it can stretch off the grain a little bit. So I always recommend that we use a steam iron and we press out that centre fold. Get rid of that crease as best you can. You may need to spray it with water and then press it. But once I've done that, and I've got a big bulk of fabric here, I've probably got about, I don't know, 3 or 4 meters in this piece. So to be able to manage that, I have it all fold up neatly. And then we need to fold our fabric so that we don't have any dips in the fold. So what I mean here is I've got the 2 selvage edges and I'm going to put them together. I'm not going to worry about what's happened here with this cut edge, because a lot of times that's not straight. I like to align the selvages together. So I'm going to put my finger in between the 2 layers, sandwich it in there just like so. Do the same up this end, and I work with about an arm width, which is about 1 metre or a yard. So I've got my fingers in between. Now I'm going to look at that fold. Now I'm going to put a twist in, and you can possibly see the twist in that fold down the bottom there. Now I'm going to shuffle this fabric across just by sliding it over till I get that draping perfectly flat on that fold. I don't want any twists in that fold whatsoever. So hopefully you can see that it's draping nice and flat. I'll put that down on the ironing surface and I will press. And I'll give myself a new crease line. You know, and what you buy off the bolt, it might be perfectly straight, but just do a double check there. because this is quite a way off the original crease line. So we'll just keep coming across. Now, I'm a person that doesn't like using a long ruler, because I find that using a long ruler, I've got to reach, I've got to keep working my hand up the ruler, and I have too much opportunity to let the ruler slip and move and become inaccurate. So I always fold my fabric into 4. So I've done the first fold. Now I'm going to take the selvage up to the fold. I'm going to have my finger in between the 2 layers, just as I did before. I'm going to hold it up, make sure it's laying flat on the fold, keep it nice and taut, put it down on the ironing surface and press. Go right along and press that so you get a nice crease line there. We'll go all the way across. You know, most times I do this at my big ironing board with my big iron, so that it's a lot quicker and more efficient than what it is here. Now we've got that all folded nicely. I'm now going to come back and I'm going to use my flower head pins and get really good quality ones that are very sharp, and I'm going to put 2 pins across here. And I will go along this piece of fabric and I'll pin about every 6 or 8 inches. Now what I'm doing here is eliminating any movement, and I find when we're working with big pieces of fabric we can cut some strips off after we've folded it. Then we can pick the fabric up and dump it over to the side here, and when we want to cut some more off it we've got to go through all the folding process again, and we usually have to get a new straight edge, which I find is a waste of good fabric and time. So by pinning it along like this, it's going to be held in place till I cut up this whole metre of fabric, or the whole yard of fabric. And you know, if I'm cutting off here and I get to about this pin or just past this pin, I'll refold the next lot that I want to work with and pin it. But I do this with all my fabrics when I'm working from big amounts of fabrics, and it won't move anywhere. It's pinned right the way through, sitting all nice and flat. So now we're going to go to the cutting board, put this down. Now having that folded into 4, I can now cut across that width with this one short ruler, and I'm not going to have to stop and move my hand up the ruler all the way across. I don't need a big cutting board, I just need a normal cutting board. Now I never use the lines on my cutting board to cut off, because I find that a lot of times these lines are not the same measurement as my ruler, but I'm very fortunate, and this is why I've chosen these boards, because this line on this board was the thinnest line I could find on any board. It's 1 thread thickness. So it gives me exactly the same measurement as what my ruler gives me. So I've got accuracy all the way. So now I'm going to use the little rotary cutter that we talked about, but I don't start cutting right on the edge of the fabric. I like to have the blade rolling before I hit the fabric. So I just need to put my hand in a nice comfortable position, and cutting with this ruler I don't get all that movement out of my fabric, cutting with the little rotary cutter, sorry. If I cut with the big blade I would have had a lot of movement as I work through. So there's my piece cut. Just snagged it there, and that little blade has cut through my 4 layers beautifully, and I got no movement. So now we want to cut some 10-inch pieces off here, because we're going to cut 10-inch squares. So I'm going to put my ruler down, so my 10-inch line is lined up here. I'm going to put a little nick in the fabric. I'll put my ruler down and I will cut. So I didn't use the board to get the measurement, I used my ruler. So now we'll open this out. We can have this folded into, still folded in half. We will cut the selvage off. Now this piece of fabric here is still pinned, so I can just throw it to the side and I'm not going to lose that nice straight edge that I've got. So that'll save me a lot of time when I come back to do the next one. So I'll put this down and I'll get my 10-inch measurement again. I'll put a little nick in here. And you can see I'm not having to move my fabric around a lot. I'm not distorting it. So there's 2 of my blocks cut. So these are for the applique. So now I can put the next 2 down. Use my ruler to get the measurement again. Oops, put it around the right way. And these rulers are made for left and right-handed people, so it's very easy for anybody to use it. Line up and cut. So there's 4 of our blocks cut already for our applique. So that's how simple it is to cut out your fabric from a big piece. So if you're going to work with big pieces and you're not going to work from a layer cake pack like I suggested that we've done, you would fold all your fabrics and pin it like this. So once you get to this cut, you take these pins out, press the next arm width, fold it, and off you go. Like a lot of times, you might be working on this quilt for a few months. Put this back in the cupboard with the pins still in it, so when you want to work on it next time, it's ready to go. We use the clover flower head pins because I find they don't rust. They don't leave holes in my fabric, so that's why I recommend those ones over all others. They are a little bit more expensive, but they really do work. So now let's just put this aside and talk about the grain of our fabric, because we're just about ready to start showing you how we use the templates to cut everything out. So if we're using the layer cake, when we do our blocks, and I'm going to come back over to this quilt on the wall, when we've got blocks like we've got different triangles here, we don't want to have a bias edge sitting on the outside. The bias usually runs across this part of the diagonal. When we do this one, this is the longest part here, but we don't want the bias sitting here. We want a straight grain here, because if I had a bias there joining it to this piece could twist and it would put this one out. So we have to be really careful of where we lay the straight grain. And on the templates that come in the pack in the kit for Lulus, we have all the straight grain lines marked on the template. But if you don't know where the straight grain is on your fabric, like usually the straight grain is the selvage edge, but these fabrics don't have a selvage on them, and they're just pinked around the outside with a pinking blade, so you're not going to use that edge, you would trim it back. But just to explain to you, the diagonal across this way or this way is your bias, so you'll see all that stretch. So you certainly don't want an outside edge of a triangle on that bias. You can stretch your fabric this way. You've got a little bit of stretch. When we stretch it this way, we've got a little bit more stretch. So the side that the least amount of stretch on is your straight grain. So that's, if you've got an arrow on your template, that's where you'll put the arrow, because the arrow will indicate where it needs to be on the straight line. So we'll now get started on cutting out around your templates to make up one of your blocks. So now we've got our templates out, we're going to just explain just briefly how to use these. Now each one of them has the name Lulu's Quilt on it. It has template 2 and it has the grain line and the seam allowance. Now there's little dots in the template, so if you were a person that wants to hand piece this, you would mark the dots so that you know where your stitching line is. But the nice thing about the templates is we've made sure that the seam allowance on the template is exactly the same as the ruler, that is exactly the same as the 1/4 inch foot. So we know everything measures exactly the same measurement. We put a lot of time and effort into making sure that's right. So now with each one of the blocks, we're going to just cut out some of the shapes for the churn dash block. The colours that we have used here is not telling you that's the colour to use. It's telling you that those 4 are out of the same colour. These 4 rectangles are out of a different colour. and then the centre's out of a different colour again, and then all the white is indicating your background fabric. So if you've got a darker background fabric, this is what you would be cutting out of that dark fabric. So it's got the T2 here, so I know I'm going to use template 2. It's got T3 here, which is template 3, and it's got T1 here. I'm going to use template 1. So they're the 3 templates I need to use to make this churn dash block. If I was making this block down here, I'd be using T4, this one, T2 and T1. So it's all explained here and how many of each one to cut. So let's just cut out using these 3 templates that we need. We'll put these ones aside. And they are out of this colour because I find that I can see this colour on any coloured fabric that I want to use. If I had clear templates, which I thought about doing, I couldn't see the lines on a lot of the fabrics. So these are the fabrics we're going to use. Now, if you lay those 3 fabrics out, because we need a dark and we need 2 mediums, and our background white is going to be our light. But use your colour clarifier tool, put it over the top and look at your fabrics, and we can instantly see that the brown is the darkest, and then we've got 2 mediums. So we've got the dark and we've got 2 mediums. So that's helping me balance the colours there for that block. From this one, you can decide whether you want a medium here and a dark here, or you could have dark here and medium here. It's your call on this. But let's say I'm going to use this brown one for these T3s. If you're confident cutting out, you could fold your fabric into 4. But, you know, be confident that you can manage that. You might want to press it to put a crease in it first, but I'm just going to cut out 1 to start with, just for those that haven't done much cutting before. The straight grain line on the template is what I'm going to put on the straight grain of the fabric. I've got stretch that way, no stretch this way, so that's where that line will lay. I'll come in a little bit from that edge that's got the pinking alongside it, because I don't want to have that in my block. Now hold your template down, and because they're engraved, put the engraving side facing down. That'll grab to there a little bit better for you. Now I'm going to use the rotary cutter, but if you feel unconfident and don't feel comfortable using the rotary cutter cutting around here, turn it to the back, put your template down, use your fabric marking pen. Now I'm just going to change to the dark lead, just by pulling that lead out. Click down the dark lead. It just takes a split second to change your lead colours over. Put your lid back on, hold your fabric, then trace around your template. Now if you wanted to, you could then cut that out with the rotary cutter, which is very easy to do. You could use the little mini ruler. Where have we put that? You could use the little mini ruler and put it down and cut alongside the edge of the ruler and cut around, just like so. If you feel more confident doing it like that, do that. You might feel like you want to cut with scissors if you're a real beginner and you don't have the equipment, but this will certainly make it more accurate and faster. So there's one cut out in that method. But let's say we're going to use the template. Put it down. Just keep your fingers in the middle. You don't want to have your fingers too close to the edge that you would run the risk of cutting your finger. Twist this around. Line it up again and cut. Now you know never to cut underarm. Please don't ever cut underarm. It's too dangerous. You always need to be cutting on the side that you can see. And never, please never put your cutting blade down opened. If I'm teaching a class, everybody gets a $10 fine because too many accidents. You can slice your fingers badly. Always, before this leaves your hand, close the blade, please, because it's just too dangerous. So you're going to go ahead and cut out all your pieces. You've got the straight grain running in the direction that it needs to run. When you're cutting around your triangles, oops, where did I put my template? We'll cut around the square. Goodness me. Here it is. So once again, straight grain needs to be on the straight grain. Just do the pull test so you know which way it's going to go. And we'll cut around this one. Now when we cut around these, you'll notice they've got the little notches. They're flattened off at the end. That's so when we come to put this together, we're going to have a more accurate join. We don't want that little tail hanging over. We can connect these little knobs up together. So we'll just cut down this side. So there's our triangle cut out. So you see what I mean about the little knob down here? I'll show you on the template, it probably looks better. So it's cut off here and cut off here. So when we start sewing the triangles together, you'll appreciate why we've put that on the template. So continue cutting out your block, and then we're going to lay it out. Now we've got one already cut out here out of a different colour combination. Now when I do this laying out, I use this felt part of the board, because I can pick this board up and go to my sewing machine and these bits won't fall off it. So it's like a little design wall. So lay out your pieces, and you've got your pattern here so you know we're at the moment laying out these brown sections. So we'll put the, oops, round the wrong way. So just be careful of how you position everything. Very easy to get things upside down and around the wrong way, and you're always better off to do a double check before you go to the sewing machine, because you don't want to sew it up and then realise that you've got it back the front, and you've got to do a little bit of reverse sewing. But talking about reverse sewing, fantastic unpicker, or reverse sewer as I call it. It's got a really nice handle that you can grab hold to, and I really could not tell you how many years I've had this unpicker, and it's still as sharp as the day I brought it. It really stays sharp for so long. So that's what I would use to do my reverse sewing. So now we'll put these down. We're going to put this colour in here, and it's always a good idea once you get a block cut out to lay it out and see that you're happy with the combination. Don't second doubt yourself. If you don't feel comfortable with the combination you've cut out to start with, always go back and change it before you start sewing, because it's a lot of work to go back and unpick a piece out to put another piece of fabric in. And if you decide you don't like this colour when you put your blocks, laid them out like this, these could be used somewhere else in the quilt, you never know, but just put them aside. Put your white bits out here. Once we get this laid out, we'll go through the stitching, little hints and tips, and pressing hints and tips. So there's my block laid out, ready to start sewing. I can pick this board up now and go straight to my sewing machine, and I can leave, once I sew these together and these together, and when I want to press, I can just turn this over and start pressing. So I'll have my sewing machine set up here, my ironing mat, my iron, and I can just go from one to the other. So let's, next we'll go to the sewing machine, and we'll start talking about getting your 1/4 inch seam perfect. We'll talk about pinning, and we'll talk about pressing.